years they were trying to get Roe v. Wade terminated, and I did it, and I'm proud to have done it.
I'm running to make Roe v. Wade the law of the land again, so women have a federal guarantee to the right to choose.
The French are going to the polls later today for the first round of parliamentary elections. President Emmanuel Macron called the snap vote after a lacklustre showing at the European Union election earlier this month. But his centrist party is now facing a disastrous result, with the latest poll showing even bigger gains for the far right.
And so it's safe to say we live in a time of political turmoil. There are so many elections going on in different parts of the world that are quite decisive for the futures of the people in those countries. The UK, the US, the EU. And it's quite a polarizing subject with extreme opinions on the far right, the far left, and everything in between. And amidst this backdrop, you have the Jehovah's Witnesses. The standards set out by the leadership of the Jehovah's Witnesses is that they maintain political neutrality, which means that they do not vote in political elections. And that's because they claim that you need to be loyal to God's kingdom, which is an actual real government. They also use the words of Jesus in John 17:16, where he said that you should be no part of the world, and also in John 18:36, when he said that his kingdom is no part of this world. Now, never mind that there can be different ways of interpreting these verses, such as the fact that Jesus was living in a time when Judea was under Roman occupation, and that the expectation at the time was that there would be a Messiah that would come to rescue the people and to restore the kingdom of Israel. And even though the broader Christian community would take the same view, that is to say that Jesus meant that we should not be part of the secular world and instead focus more on a spiritual world with the kind of values that are espoused in the Bible as being a part of God's kingdom, the fact is, at the end of the day, we are all living on this planet, and we are, most of us, part of society, where the general expectation is that we, at least in democracies, get to decide, get to participate, and choose our representatives within a framework that protects our rights and our freedoms, and where we can hold our leaders accountable. And you can imagine if everyone in a society was a Jehovah's Witness, then the entire system would crumble. And in light of the elections taking place in different parts of the world, I wanted to revisit what Jehovah's Witnesses have to say on voting. And there's an article on jw.org which says, the title is, "Which leader will you choose? What does the Bible say?" And the first point there is, human leaders are limited. And it goes on to quote Psalm 146, verse 3 and 4, "Do not put your trust in princes, nor in the Son of Man, who cannot bring salvation. His breath goes out, he returns to the ground, on that very day his thoughts perish." There's a similar message in Ecclesiastes 2, verse 18 and 19. "Even the most capable leaders will eventually die. Furthermore, they cannot guarantee that any of their good works will be continued by those who come after them." So there's a general sense of human beings not being competent enough to lead, and thus, what's the point of taking part in an election of leaders? And since all these leaders are eventually going to die, well, then you should just stay at home and not vote. Huh? Does that make any sense to you? The fact is, we all are dependent on a society functioning with the rule of law, because that means that we have protections, so that we are able to live our lives, to have economies, economic growth, and social development, even down to property rights, being able to own your own home, being able to live with a reasonable expectation that there won't just be civil unrest at any given moment. Now, of course, there are parts of the world that don't have that security, and that, I think, shows even more the importance of taking part in the political process where you are able to and where you do have a functioning democracy. And so the article goes on to say, "It does not belong to man who is walking even to direct his step." That comes from Jeremiah 10:23. And the question is asked, is there anyone who can provide good leadership today? And that's when they go on to present to us that the most qualified leader is Jesus Christ, and says, for example, Matthew 6:10, Jesus is the king of God's kingdom, a government that rules from heaven. And then Psalm 2:12, honor the Son, in quotes Jesus Christ, or God will become indignant. And it goes on to present the most qualified leader, who is God and his Son Jesus Christ. And again, that's all very well and good in a spiritual context, but as long as you're living in a society where you have a reasonable expectation of being able to own property, being able to live a peaceful life without the threat of violence and unrest at every disagreement, because there is an actual framework to address injustices, there is an actual rule of law that everyone is bound to, where there is actually an expectation on a government to serve the needs of its people, then I think one should be free to participate in protecting those rights, in ensuring accountability, in promoting development and democracy, so as to ensure that society continues to function and that people can thrive. But of course, groups like Jehovah's Witnesses function through making sure that their followers are isolated from the rest of society. And so while the concept of democracy encourages the inclusion of different views, and that people from different backgrounds in society will take part in the process to make sure that it is more equitable, that it is more beneficial for the entire population, you have this group that is purposefully holding its members outside of the process, and I'm sure there are other groups that do similar things. And by isolating the members of that group, their views and their opinions do not count. And so you could say that the will of the people isn't going to accurately represent the entire population if large groups of people do not take part in expressing what their will is. And in these polarized times, that could mean that some marginalized groups become even more marginalized, even more invisible, leading to not just their needs being neglected by the elected officials, but also leaving the path open for extremist leaders to come to power. When small extremist groups have a disproportionately large share of the vote, it can lead to a weakening of the checks and balances that are usually so important in a healthy democracy. And I think it's a shame when entire groups such as the Jehovah's Witnesses are taught to be apathetic when it comes to politics, because we as the population do need to continue to hold the powerful accountable. Otherwise, the risk is that they can get away with being ineffective or even corrupt. And for those of you that haven't ever been witnesses, you might be thinking, well, what's the harm if someone does vote? Well, as usual, in such a high control group, when you go against the grain, then you do risk exclusion or some kind of shunning within the group. Now, that's why it was so interesting for me to observe how polarized the witnesses were during the time of the pandemic, as a lot of them were very suspicious about the vaccine. At the same time, the governing body was encouraging them to take the vaccine. And it became clear, especially in the US, that quite a few witnesses have a leaning towards, shall we say, the more conservative type of government. And when you do have such serious situations, such as a pandemic, questions of whether or not to engage in war, the distribution of taxes, how do we prioritize the money that we all contribute? Do we want a society where we take care of others, such as in Europe with the socialist countries, where the taxes go towards helping the weaker in society? There are so many questions that are decided by our leaders that we elect. And so just taking a step back and saying, oh no, we vote for God, we don't vote for human leaders. And at the same time, you're dependent on these governmental structures to be able to live in society, to be able to own property, or even to be able to get funding from the government. There was a situation where Jehovah's Witnesses' funding from the Norwegian government was stopped because of their practice of shunning. And the witnesses are fighting to get that funding back. How are you so embroiled in the structure of government that you see to be so incompetent, so useless, that you do not want your millions of members to take part in it or to even exercise their right to vote. But as always, everyone falls in line with what the governing body says, and I did too. But at the ripe old age of 25, I was more than happy to cast my first ballot in a political election, and I've done it ever since. I would say to each his own. We should all be free to take part in the political process, and the more people that do, the better and stronger our democracies can become. Well, that was enough political pontificating from me for today. Have a nice rest of your day.